Hi, I'm Manuel Arroyo Kalen. I'm really happy to be here because I have some lovely friends that I haven't seen for some time that have come to see this presentation, and there's many others whom I have met in the past. I heart from an older decade of PhD research here in Cambridge, and indeed this work that I will present now started as a research question when I was a student at Cambridge. Um, I am aware that Francois's network is very much focused on plants, and I think plants are a very important part of why I'm interested in soils. So I'm going to, as you do, I am going to, in a sense, try and make a case for what my focus on terrestrial landscapes and soil formation brings in for an understanding of the relationship between humans and plants over the long term in the Amazon basin. And hence, when we agreed on a title, it felt like an overreach, and it probably will be. And I just have to ask you, how much time do I have?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Oh, that's going to be a major overreach. But essentially, I thought I'd talk a little bit about dark earths, just to give everybody a sense of what we know about it. And I think that's really important, and hopefully in the discussion a little bit more about that, but also reference intercultural and interdisciplinary projects that we are putting together with a number of colleagues from Brazil, mainly in the Northwest Amazon now for nearly almost a decade. Is something that we call the intercultural archaeological program of the Northwest Amazon, and we are now on our second project. And you can see this. It's not meant to be a corporate sponsor, but I just want to acknowledge all the sponsors and all the actors that are invested in doing this. I wish I could remove this thing here to put some others. Interesting. Well, there you go. That's a fast way of going through my talk. If you just come back, there you go. It's got a bit of delay. Anyways, let's talk about what archaeologists, and I take it archaeologists here, it means everybody who's interested in the past, so just to make it wide and inclusive, what we actually know and what we need to know about dark earths and what we do not know about them yet. For those of you who have not encountered these extraordinary bits of human modification, to summarize it in a very, very plain terms, for over 100 years, we've known that in the Amazon basin, there are large expanses of soils. These soils have been strongly modified by humans. We have plenty of evidence that that's the case, and I will go in detail what the sort of scientific study of this evidence yields in terms of understanding what that means. What that entails then is that any understanding of the Amazon as essentially a landscape that is limiting for human occupations or for human adaptation or for human innovation, take your theoretical flavor, is essentially flawed if the primordial argument is that the soils of the Amazon are indeed very infertile. And this has usually been an understanding based on the adoption of an agriculture that is intensive, that is monocrop, and that is based on essentially felling forests to grow crops. What tends to happen in the Amazon basin, where the horizontal soils are very thin, is that once you deforest, you lose your nutrients very, very, very quickly. And as a consequence, one of the traditional strategies to cultivate in rural landscapes and in the Amazon today is slash and burn cultivation, which is in turn based on extensive fallow cultivation. Dark earth, talk a little bit about how that might have been different in the past. And let me then move on. Now, I say we've known about this for 100 years, but that doesn't impede that every so often we get somebody coming around saying, I want to make a big name for myself in a big paper and present yet another rejoinder saying, yes, these things are natural soils, etc., etc. So I just thought I'd bring this one up, which came up from a bunch of colleagues in Brazil, and a sort of very strong rebuttal by more than a 2 or 3 or 4 projects worth of people that have been working on these soils for a very long time, saying we think that this is not correct. In fact, we think it's a little bit BS, that is black soil. And consequently, a long response to that effect. And I just want to reference it here in case when you decide to talk about the subject, you just decide to cite that paper. I want to advise that you take a look at the response. But But move, oops, that's your computer phone, so can I turn it around? It's slightly confusing for me. But let's go down to the very basics. And I've written quite a bit about this, so for some this will sound like repetition. But let's just say that if we have to describe what Amazonian dark earths are in a really simple way, we can start with the fact that they are modified old surfaces that have been occupied by humans. That means we have landforms in which human occupation takes place. Human occupation produces all sorts of things. It enriches soil matrices, and those soil matrices eventually are enriched by long-term decay of bits and pieces that either incorporate themselves in a sort of particulate way, so in small little inclusions, or they get dissolved and they become part of the fabric and the essential chemistry of the soil. That means it's the solution and absorption onto clays. And so if we think of dark earths, we might talk about them as soils. We might talk about them as black char or biochar or something that I'll have something to say about. But ultimately, let's not forget that it all starts, at least in our understanding at present of these, with human occupations, that is settlements, in which the modification of the settlement area has led to enrichment of that land surface and subsequent rechurning and remodifying of the soil through natural processes and possibly further occupation processes. And that's, I think, quite important for a number of understandings. This then takes us back to an understanding of the broad variability of these soils. And this is a map from Wim Sombrick, published in 1966, still current today. The book is called The Amazonian Soils. It was his PhD, where he demonstrated, he was a soil scientist, he demonstrated that the overall spatial distribution of soils such as dark earths occur along bluffs. Those bluffs seem to have natural soils that in this case, like many of the soils on the lower Amazon, are oxysoils or latosols, and you can clearly distinguish between these soils that are not all distributed all around, but that are clearly associated to bluffs and are full of artifacts. And then there's a second category, which is of a lot of interest to our talk today, which is, he referred to as terras mulatas, or we refer to them as brown earths, or suelos pardos in Spanish. And here the issue is, what do we make of all of this? And Wim's interpretation, which I think stands more or less correct, is that terras pretas are associated to human settlement, the process I've just described. Terras mulatas, or brown earths, are associated to landscape modification beyond settlement areas. Note the scale here. So this is about 400 meters. So we're talking now, this is around 2-3 kilometers. And the soil matrix of these soils is somewhat different from the dark earths that we sort of see iconically referred to as terras pretas, and also different from the natural soils, or the soils that dominate in those landforms, so in this case, oxysoils. So in many ways, we have a three-way distinction to make when we talk about dark earths. We have natural soil, so to speak, we have heavily modified settlement-related soils, and we have everything else that is in between. And here it's important to point out that there's an obvious continuum between these things, because soil classes are not biological species, so we don't create a taxonomy of them that works like a biological taxonomy. Rather, they're reference points, and oftentimes soil types merge into one another. We won't get into the pedology of this right now. But that continuum, on the other hand, when we read it from the point of view of its formation, needs to be understood stratigraphically, and that means as a palimpsest of various occupations that occur upon each other. And these two terms, continuum, so we don't know where it begins and where it ends, really begins to be clear when you cut vertical cuts through it and you begin to see what these soils look like. So, three dominant models have been forwarded for the formation of dark earths. Francois, I'm just going to bring this little thing down from your screen here. There we go. There are three basic models. The so-called kitchen model by Wim Sombrick. My colleague Morgan Schmidt has also added to this. The essential premise is that everything that you consume on settlement goes into a pile called a rubbish midden. This rubbish midden eventually becomes a focus of concentration, burning, management, etc. And this stuff, in a sense, is either moved around by people or gets remobilized as a result of site formation process, regrowth of vegetations, and you name it, so that it butters the landscape and forms a dark earth layer. A second model is a house garden model, which has suggested that, wait, we don't necessarily see so many archaeological remains in many of these sites, and we still find very dark earth. Maybe we're looking at former orchards. And these orchards might not be the brown earth that I've just described a moment ago, but might actually be the areas between houses in which soil is being used for the growth of perhaps not, I would say, staple crops, but perhaps chili peppers, medicinal plants, maybe some sweet potato, maybe some cucurbits and others that occur normally as camp followers or in the vicinity of settlements. A third model is the house model. I'm a big fan of house model. You'll see that in a moment, which basically suggests that there's a lot of potential accumulation of debris taking place within the types of houses that we find in the Amazon basin, which are by and large organic constructions made out of wood that then produce sediment troughs in which things can accumulate, and then thatching, which is usually, I would say, covered in soot if burning has been taking place inside, but that provides another pool of black carbon that then goes into the soil, and that creates a big lump of modified soil that then gets formed. Now, the short answer to all of this is that they're probably all correct. So there's no real answer to this. And just to illustrate this here, I present two pictures which are, I think, telling in their own right. The first one is a picture from the inside of a longhouse in the Caquetá River. It's a beautiful picture for many reasons, but I draw your attention to the set of stools that we find here. That's the area where people are chewing coca powder, mambe or ipadu, and it's the area where people get together to do that. Over there you see the area where they toast manioc, two big drums hanging there. I'm sure that will resonate in other parts of the world. Big log here being ashed. That big log being ash there is really not a log, but a piece of tin. But the ash that is there is from Cecropia, which is a follower of slash and burn cultivation, and is usually used to create the ash that you mix with coca powder to create mambe or powdered coca. So you can see that what is happening inside the house is going to immediately impact the chemistry of the soils that underlie the house, and it will be differential. And hence, I think this idea of palimpsest of things taking place, individual activities taking place, and soils getting remixed, reworked to create this bigger entity that we call the dark earth is one that we need to keep in mind at all different scales. That picture there is actually my redrawing of Clark Erickson's lovely picture of 2003, which I found so good, and I tried to imitate it, and I ended up sketching it again by hand. It's one of those things like a Borges novel that you try and write the good novel again, and you write the same novel. But I did acknowledge it very clearly. But the point here is, I think Clark is essentially right in saying, well, what we see as a patch is probably the result of composite processes that we cannot tell from a patch of dark earth what it really looks like. So here, his premise is houses, ring middens around it, multiple houses, different types of settlements, more different types of middens, the moving of settlements around creating larger expanses of dark earth. And of course, this might indicate the bluff-like settlements that Wim Somberg described or might describe others. So we have all these lovely models to explain what dark earths are all about. And these, if I now want to reach out a little bit to the plant world, let's just say on the soil world, we have, I think, two essential processes taking place. One which is cumulative. It's about how sediments get produced, enriched by human activity, and get remobilized and create progressively higher surfaces in which we have thick deposits. Us archaeologists, we dig these things. So we begin to find these artifacts, which are my ampersands here, we find them in stratigraphic order. They're in correct stratigraphic order. What that must mean is that essentially these are continued occupations that get layered upon each other by various forms of site formation processes. So we have stratigraphy, and what our pedologist colleagues tend to describe as soil horizons tend to really be defined sediment strata that then get recognized as soil horizons or soil subhorizons. But that's not to say that our soil scientists are wrong, and one very important process that they describe in soil formation processes is the process where soil horizons themselves form, which is essentially that what takes place on a surface trickles down, to use very colloquial language, and begins to differentiate what are the layers that you see. I use the word layers quite advisedly, the layers that you see in the soil profile. So these are soil horizons proper. They're not layers. They didn't form one on top of the other. Rather, it's the trickling down of material, charcoal, organic matter, and you name it, that is taking place. And we know that this is a process from archaeological middle range theory. We know this is a process that takes place in human occupations. People trample on things, they step on things, they get pushed in, they go down 2 or 3 centimeters, and we can talk a lot more about that. But I think this is a process that is also taking place in dark earth formation. So you can begin to see the bigger picture of what a terra preta or dark earth really is quite expansive once we start picking on the different details. And this is why I often say terra pretas are artifacts, but they're very sui generis artifacts, because unlike the material culture that we like to refer to as artifacts in archaeology, which are bounded, clear, they do have chains of production, but they are bounded and clear. These entities go all over the place and they expand, and they're kind of limitless. That picture there is also a copy from another picture that came out in a paper by Patrick Roberts, but this one I created this picture myself, and so I think it's legitimate that I've taken it into another publication. And essentially what it wants to show is the long-term history of landscapes with these soils and how that impacts on our understanding of vegetation, and particularly anthropogenic indicators in standing biodiversity. So if you follow the general gist of it, it's one of these time sequences that are just illustrative and heuristic, really. The top picture wants to show people settling a landscape and sort of clearing it lightly with some fruit trees around. The middle picture wants to show settlements and areas around settlements that are being used. And of course, the concentration of edible fruit trees, such as palms, begins to be denser as a result of camp followers and the very planting and maintenance of fallow areas around campsites. And as these places are abandoned, here, let's think 16th century, 17th century, massive depopulation as a result of European colonization, a lot of running away from the fronts of colonization according to where in the Amazon you are. So a lot of forest regrowth does take place, but what we have are matrices of enriched soils, which are the result of these activities. And then we have seed banks, and these seed banks continue over time. And I think some of the work of William Ballet, when he first published about the question of cultured forests, if those who actually read the articles will find in those lovely essays in the New York Botanical Garden that he actually referenced the fact that he had found dark earths full of pottery, and this is where he had found lots of different types of plants. So that's, I guess, one way to connect it to the bigger picture of plants. It's a legitimate question to say what makes them so different, and here I will whisk through some very clear and very often repeated by me slides that refer to how these soils differ. Just to give you a sense, these are soil profiles, the sorts of things that us archaeologists like to excavate and also draw. They're both on the same landform. So what we're referring to as anthropogenic dark earth effectively reflects all of this that is formed on the very same landform as that. Now, if we look at these in some more detail, we'll find that the various forms of geochemistry and other parameters that we can measure in them, pH, carbon contents, phosphorus, calcium, etc., they are staggeringly different. And because these are measurements done on the, as it were, natural soil vis-a-vis the modified soil, I think it's very clear that when we can measure above 20 parts per mil of calcium vis-a-vis the natural background that is 300 meters away, we have clear evidence of enrichment that, oh, it coincides with all this stuff here, which is a fairly rockless landscape. It's all pottery. And indeed, these are some of the materials that I studied in my PhD, which were very dense urban-like occupation sites, 19 hectares, 20 hectares. They're very large sites. And so the question of dark earth becomes very clearly one associated with occupations. But I've also spent some time studying dark earth in other parts of the Amazon, and I'm going to perhaps provide some quick insights from those in a moment. Another aspect of these studies has been the study of them microscopically. And here we also, this is a technique that I learned how to do in Cambridge with Charlie French, who's now retired. But essentially it's about making thin sections of the soils that we excavate. And what we find in those thin sections as we can identify the particulate inclusions that are responsible for these lovely chemical measurements. And so we find small fragments of fish bone. These are very, very tiny. The scale here, my finger is about 20 microns, so that's a 1/20th of a millimeter. You can see in the middle picture, all those black dots are small, tiny specks of charcoal. And they're very tiny, is what we refer to as silt size, which is 2 to 63 microns, which is a particulate size that is very, very tiny, but it's not exactly molecular, it's not nano, it's simply very, very tiny. And what we know from studying lots of these, or what I know from studying lots of these, and my PhD students are doing the same, is that these are the breaking down of charcoal fragments that broke down and broke down through soil fauna until they get very integrated into soil matrix, and is what gives a lot of the darkness of these soils. The other part being that the increasing retention of organic matter sort of works in tandem with charcoal. Other bits that I won't go into, they're too complex and or pedological, if you will. I can skip a few. Just before I move on, one thing that I'd like to mention is what about brown earth? And I've mentioned before that these are really interesting soils to me because, okay, we've been talking about terras pretas, they're associated to occupations, lots of pottery, etc. But I'm quite interested in what happens beyond settlements. And here in my PhD, I did survey one area where we had so-called brown earth or terras mulatas. And to make a very long story short, yes, they are deep ray horizons, and these deep ray horizons have very interesting signals that can be measured to demonstrate that these are areas that were burned very significantly from fairly low in the formation of this profile. That's a signal that it's a lovely measurement of this is something called magnetic susceptibility. Now that's quite significant because it's telling us that these, which have quite a bit of charcoal in them, it's not that people are just sort of taking charcoal made in settlements and chucking that out onto the field, but there's actual burning taking place on these surfaces. So the magnetic susceptibility is actually a proxy for thermal application on the sediment itself because it's measuring the magnetization or the magnetic susceptibility of iron. So that is quite a good proxy for that. And it's showing us that these are indeed soils that have been burned. And these, I will just move on then, permits us to begin to think, okay, perhaps what we are tracking through those brown earths are these kinds of situations, the situations of what we refer to as slash and burn cultivation. And those of you who have worked in the Amazon and read the literature there will know that proper studies of slash and burn cultivation, such as Paddock and Denevans, will refer very much to slash and burn, not as a sort of a reciting of burning surfaces, but rather as an area of long fallow maintenance with lots of tree crops being maintained in place. And so I think the relevance of tracking these brown earth beyond settlements is an increasing focus of attention. Just going to go through some lovely pictures. This is from the Lower East Sana River where I've just returned last month. This talk will not talk a lot about that. But here's a picture that I want to point to you. You can see these patches. Any satellite image on Google Earth will show you something similar. Patches of 1 hectare sized gardens here. And here the essential question that I think drives my current questions on this, it goes back to William Denevans, the geographer William Denevan, his paper in 1992 suggesting that perhaps pre-colonial, pre-European invasion, pre-colonial slash and burn cultivation could not have been as extensive as we know today, largely because that's associated with the presence of iron tools, that's machetes and axes, that only became available from the 18th century as the Dutch traded with people in the Northwest Amazon in exchange for slaves, and they gave them booze and tools. And so there is a process in which the colonization of the Amazon by Europeans leads to a landscape that is now populated by these very efficient tools to make large gardens and to move gardens very quickly once the fertility of the soil drops. And that technology is not there before the 18th century. So Bill Denevan, I think, speculates very intelligently that the types of cultivation that must have existed in the past must have been much more intensive. And here the call goes to Bosserup's initial formulation between extensive and intensive, as opposed to the way intensification is used generally. And if these were very intensive in the sense of spatially intensive forms of cultivation, they must have been very fire reliant, because how else are you going to maintain that huge amount of forest open and cultivate as a way to create an agricultural lifestyle. So I think this is where the big draw for me is right now in the study of soils around settlements, to see if we can determine to what extent they show the presence of indications of long-term management that can be associated to the inventories of often semi-domesticated or at least managed plants that we find around settlements, or that some research shows that there is there. Here are some pictures just to comment on these statements. This is basically, you can see by vegetation that this is an area of capoeira, as they call in Brazil. So it's a long regrown fallow area, and it's basically one moment in the last few years when our indigenous collaborators and ourselves we found one area of dark earths where somebody remembered that an old settlement had existed but had never been there. So this is beautiful moment in which we've got augers and shovels, etc., and somebody, whoa, lo and behold, the soil is dark, and pottery is like, whoa, these guys are talking something. And then one of the beautiful experiences that happens through this research with indigenous peoples in the Northwest Amazon, these are Tucanoan groups here, is that this moment is one that often engenders conversations and memories and remembrances of longer and older stories, often in this case associated with the period of the rubber boom and people running away from rubber tappers and where they hid away from them in small places beyond rivers. Here's one example of perhaps a terra preta associated with settlement, given the amount of pottery, but this one perhaps is another, and this is an area in another site in the Middle Wopes. You can see these are these sort of piles of dirt that we have here that go from yellow to black. Is essentially we auger every 20 centimeters, so this is about 1.80 meters deep. You can see by that judgment that this is about a 80-meter deep dark earth. And here it's a very large area in a sandy riverscape. And it's settled, it's a settlement. And one of the interesting things that we find here is that although you will find pottery associated to that, these dark earths don't have huge amounts of pottery. So they don't have huge occupations that produce a lot of pottery associated with them, and they're still very large and extensive areas. And this then leads us back to the questions of palimpsests, continuums, and to what extent our two folk categories, terra pretas and terras mulatas, or dark earths and black earths and brown earths, really capture the variability of what we're seeing, which is human settlement, transformation of human settlement areas, modification of areas between loci where debris and other burning material can accumulate, and also the broader landscape that is being managed around it. I think Francois is giving me signals that I should finish soon. No? Good. Just to sort of underscore this then, and just to highlight then that if that picture there is intended to show you that the majority of dark earths that we find and we have known so well so far are often associated with plenty of settlement debris. This picture, which I just snapped out of my photo archive as I was on the train, this is from excavations that we did with the Voces de Amazonia Indígena project in the last month. Well, it's a sort of specialized knowledge, but it will show you a fairly dark and deep patch of dark earths. And one of the interesting things is that the scarcity of archaeological remains associated with this is staggering. It is a fairly large area. We've excavated in different places. We know it's anthropogenic because there's still evidence of anthropogenic activity, and the site itself is an area of waterfalls that is full of rock art, etc., etc. But it begins to be one of those cases where we can say, have we got our finger correctly on the real issue here, that we have associated dark earths to settlements because we've studied some emblematic cases full of pottery. We then augured around those sites and we found brown earths, and we say, okay, must be the out gardens. And kudos to Deneman for suggesting that they won't be as big as they would have been in the present, and that's an interesting research question. But we might yet have to come back to the very idea that anthropogenic dark earths are exclusively associated with settlement activities, and come back to the idea that we don't really know how to finesse these categories yet to actually identify large expanses of modified soils that might look a lot more like house gardens than we know at present. How much time do I have, Francois? 5 minutes. So in my last 5 minutes, just so for general interest, I will perhaps try and put this in a slightly bigger context. I'll start with a paper that we published a few years ago with my colleague Phil Riris. It's one of those papers in which we collated a whole bunch of radiocarbon dates. This took the participation of a number of PhD students who helped collate this data bank. It also started with my PhD when I started piling up radiocarbon dates from all of Amazonia. Archaeologists have for a while now developed the idea that you can accumulate the number of radiocarbon dates that date a specific point in a specific part of the landscape, chop off, as it were, the redundancies that would happen if you date two places at the same time that are a meter apart, and then use the accumulated total as a proxy for population. It's a very rough measure of population, but when you have thousands of dates, it begins to tell you a little bit about where there is known that there are settlement activities of a certain intensity. And this overall pattern here is what we see in the Amazon. I draw your attention to the years here. So this is the year 0 or year 1 of the Common Era. This is 500 AD, 1000 AD, 1500 AD. So that's the general pattern that we identified for the Amazon as a whole. And it's worthwhile commenting on a couple of things. You can see that there is a takeoff moment here, that around in the last centuries of 0 AD, we have a moment in which we see a much higher density of radiocarbon dates across the basin as a whole. 2 points to make here. If we decompose this into the bigger landscape, and now look at the dots, reds and blues that you see over there, we will see that that's an aggregate measure of what's happening in the basin as a whole. A quick glance of what you see there, and apologies if the letters, the numbers are slightly small, but a quick glance of that, they basically are different time slices. And what they do suggest is that population growth has not been across the board homogeneous in the Amazon over this entire period. Rather, there's regions that have grown and then have slowed down their growth. There's others that have grown and then have slowed down the growth, and things are moving in different things. Still, however, the overall pattern is one of population growth taking off at around 300, 400, 500 AD. Now, this is interesting from my point of view, because if we're going to ask about the age of dark Earths, we might ask as a hypothesis, are anthropogenic dark Earths associated to this kind of evidence that population density increases at a given point in Amazonian pre-colonial history? And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, because I think the great majority of anthropogenic dark Earths really date to this period or further. And here I'm going to have to take a moment to explain why also that counts a lot for our understanding of the pattern of Amazonian dark Earths, because what happens is that this very simple 100-year occupation can modify settlements and produce a sort of fabric of soil that we would later recognize as a dark Earth. But if we have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 occupations spanning 3, 4, 500 and 600 years, the chances are that that expanse is going to be larger, more visible, closer to the surface, more likely to be encountered by present-day settlement activity, present-day agriculture, and so on and so forth. And as a consequence, it's going to be more visible. So much of what we describe today as the dark Earths of the Amazon are really those encounters. They are the encounters of us, present-day settlers, with this anthropogenic landscape that was created in pre-colonial times, and we are encountering those large expanses. And this is why people talk about, you can talk about dark Earths in superlatives, super fertile, super large, super thick, it grows, etc. But in reality, as a process, it's a very drip by drip, bit by bit process. And if we were to look into when they start forming, well, we'll find 2 basic principles. They could have started forming 9,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, wherever you had some settlement that created the conditions for that. But the larger expanses that we see as dark Earths today all tend to date from around the time range that I've described here, because that's when we have consistent population growth in the Amazon, yielding an up to I would say the beginning of the second millennium AD. We do have some questions here, because if you go back to the peak I showed you before, that peak, if I can go back, thank you very much. That peak shows you that there is a moment around 1200 AD where we have the highest density of population. And we don't know if that peak is a result of the fact that people are sampling lesser radiocarbon dates in the period 1200 to 1500, if that has been landscape that has been ultimately more modified, or if it really does reflect that there was an apogee in the overall population growth, and then it slowly, settled to something that was more normal. I wish I was tall enough to show that that's a flat line if you take off that blip. And if that's the case, then what we see as a fall-off curve is really the consequence of European colonization. But be that as it may, then we might think that the overall presence of anthropogenic dark earth as a big feature of the Amazonian landscape might be associated to that peak in population, which is not only seen in dark earth, but also if we go to Llanos de Mojos, for instance, some of the largest sites there reach around 1200, and then they go into radio silence for a little while and populations decrease, etc. I'm going to skip this slide now because it would get a little bit too complicated. I'll just finish for those of you who sort of tend to examine the literature and sort of rapid search for knowledge on this. And I'd like to highlight, these are publications by one of our colleagues, Crystal Michael, now almost a decade old. But these maps in which she describes the overall distribution of dark earth and makes a number of statements about how they are limited into one region and not to another, etc., are fairly complicated, and in my view, don't have enough field work and enough sampling of behind them to actually make those statements. One of the things for us social scientists that we need to learn is that once somebody galvanizes something like this in a big journal, people just tend to repeat it without reading the supplementary material. And so this, which is Crystal McMichael's predictive model of the distribution of dark earths, well, it's a predictive model basically based on trying to connect soil type and relief and proximity to rivers, but in reality it has little to do with the actual distribution. This is a map produced by Charles Clement et al., where again we see high density of anthropogenic soils and a lot of dark dots here and there, which are called archaeological sites. We are working up in this region over here, and I can assure you that every time we find a site, there's a 50% chance that the matrix of the soil is going to be dark, modified. It might not be the large expanses that we have identified in the lower Amazon as archaeologists, but they're still modified soils. And indeed, my work in the Colombian Amazon has shown the same. My work in the Peruvian Amazon has shown the same. So here are some pictures from that. See, that's dark earth from the upper Amazon, the Rio Napo in Ecuador. This is my esteemed and rest in peace colleague, Santiago Rios Panduro, when we surveyed, the picture's not very good, I'm afraid, on that screen, where we surveyed another dark earth in the vicinities of Iquitos. This is work that I did with Stefan Rostan in Ecuador, also showing dark earths formed on house middens. These are essentially the same as, in many ways, they're the same as the expanses that we study, but they still retain the shape of the middens. And these are some of the project pictures of our recent excavations in the Northwest Amazon in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, which I'm not going to have too much time to talk about, but I think pictures speak quite loudly that we have very clear dark earths in São Gabriel da Cachoeira, which on that map is there. So to make a long story short, I think we should be very careful with these kinds of models when we read quickly, just like we should be very careful with the types of reasoning that goes into them. And as I put it here, these models are presumed to be predictive, but they're not even prescriptive. They're not predictive. They're basically descriptive, and they're essentially rehashed and rehashed and rehashed again as evidence of something that is not. Yeah, I think I'm just about to say the dark earths have a sort of a punchline. That's the short of it. They are likely present everywhere in lowland South America, and indeed, I think they are pretty much everywhere. And I think I'm going to have to stop there because I'm not going to be able to talk much more without Francois sort of pulling my legs. So there, let's call it an end there. Thank you.
For starting, I would just like to introduce myself a bit. Once I don't know you all. So I'm an archaeologist. I'm based in Brazil, and I've been working with archaeobotany and organic residue analysis since the beginning of my career in my master dissertation and my PhD, which I defended last year. And I've been working with plant-people interactions in agriculture, biodiversity, the impacts of colonialism in mobility patterns and biodiversity uses. So I just added some of my paper. Many of them are in Portuguese. And more recently, as Francoise has spoken, I've been working in collaboration with researchers from the National Foundation of Indigenous People, the FUNAI, on using archaeological methods to help understanding the life quality and the life conditions of isolated indigenous people. So some of the thoughts I'm going to share here come from this partnership. And sorry, I lost my here. And just for saying, I'm not going to show many of the data and methods I've been collecting. So I just wanted to say that from my PhD, I've been working then with, those are the 3 papers I didn't publish yet, but are the results of my PhD. So I've been working with AD sites, the same Amazonian dark earth Manuel has spoken, with starch grain analysis and lipid analysis, but also in another kind of sites without Amazonian dark earths, which are geoglyphs and earth moves in southwestern Amazon, where I have been analyzing macro remains of plants and isotopic indicators of cultivation to tackle extensive versus intensive agriculture. And what I will speak a bit today, it's about another research with a kind of foodway that is name it here as the indigenous breads. I think this will be a bit more clear in some time. So just moving forward, while I was doing my researchers and organizing data about what we had about archaeobotany in the Amazon, I faced this paper, which is a paper discussing the rates of extinction of biodiversity in the world, from Humphrey and his collaborator. And he's saying that more of 600 plant species have been lost since they started to collect and systematize plant biodiversity, which is mainly since the publication of the Species Plantarum by Linné. And he's analyzing those plant word checklist of selected plant families, and he defends that these extinction rates are higher in South America and in wet tropic environments. So when I saw this, even that there is discovered plants, so 600 were extinct, but most of them were rediscovered again in the present, in the more recent present. It came to my mind what was happening besides deforestation, besides climatic events, or besides natural impact forces making those plants to go extinct. And at the same time, a paper was published by Carolina Levis and collaborators saying that there was an influence from indigenous long-term forest management in the forest structure itself, because they were seeing that from the whole forest, only 1.9% was dominated by 227 species, which are the so-called hyperdominant species. I'm sorry about the Portuguese slide. And so those species were more highly ubiquitous in the forest than the rest of the species. And many of those plants were being managed by indigenous people since the beginning of occupation. I've put the pictures of some of them, the açaí, the Brazil nut, and this other fruit with the poroma caimito, the abil. And it made me wonder, so what was happening with those species across time? So during my PhD, I did a archaeobotanical database, collecting information from 188 archaeological sites, and I've been faced with the interpretation that the more recent was the occupation, the most biodiverse was also the set of plants that were being used by people. And also, so I started to analyzing this archaeobotany and paleoecology database that I'm still compiling. So the work is not done. I'm doing this in collaboration with a project coordinated here in Brazil with Unicamp, which is putting together an atlas of the Amazon, thinking about the relationship between pre-colonial and colonial periods. And we started to see then that most of those predominant plants are actually being cultivated and managed by indigenous people since the beginning of occupation around 12,000 years ago. Some of those plants, and what has been interesting for me and I wanted to share, is that the biggest biodiversities or the biggest amount of plant species that we found in archaeological sites are also related to the biggest archaeological sites. So it seems that the higher the density of the occupation, the higher the biodiversity that people were managing. If we see this through time, in the bottom graphic, we can see a pattern that shows that we have biodiversity increasing across time, reaching a peak around 2,500 years ago, and after diminishing a bit, which goes already from 500 BP to the present. What I think is interesting is that, of course, we can have bias of research. We can have sites that are more representative or better studied than other sites. But what I also think is interesting is that this curve is almost the same curve as Manuel has shown of the population dynamic across the Holocene. Well, what would be the connection between this increased biodiversity and social patterns and social relationships across the Holocene? So I just wanted to bring one of the results of my master dissertation, which was held in the shell mound of Monte Castelo. It's a shell mound that is occupied since 7,000 years ago until the onset of colonialism. And I've studied the archaeobotanical remains, and what we have seen is that there is the same pattern as the database is showing, is that there is a slightly increase of biodiversity use across this stratigraphic sequence. So we started to think that different from what people were proposing for the Amazon, that people were being more and more specialized in plant consumption and production across time, we were having a pattern of diversification. And this probably has to do with a way of responding also to climatic events and to social events. So this is the set of plants that we found in the shell mound. And in the right side, you can see the distribution among the cultural phases. So we have Cupim, the most old phase of occupation of the site, then Sinimbu, a transition, and the Bacabal phase, which is the most recent one. And what we can see is that there is an increase of species after the transition to the Bacabal phase, exactly where we have a moment of drier than present period. So we started discussing that probably increasing biodiversity was also a way of increasing resilience to climatic and social events. So what kind of social events would be this? I think this is an ongoing debate on Amazonian archaeology that is connecting kinds of political structure to ways of cultivation. This is a paper a model published by Jonas Gregório de Souza and colleagues, which is proposing that greater resilience to climatic change are achieved by autonomous village and diversified production in agroforestry systems. In another side, we have many other authors that are looking now, mostly now that the urbanism debate is really light up again, and looking for places that would have been places of intensification of agriculture connected to urbanism in southwestern Amazon. So I bring this paper by Humberto Lombardo, in which he's defending that he finally found maize monoculture in an urbanist place in southwestern Amazon. I'm gonna go back later on this paper, but I just wanted to say that this is an ongoing debate between what kind of cultivation and plant consumption were truly supporting pre-colonial populations. So just to move a bit a subject, but a complementary subject, about food waste specifically, because so far I've been talking about biodiversity and plant cultivation, but I would also like to say some words about food traditions and food waste, and some specific plants that call my attention to rethink about the models that we are proposing for pre-colonial Amazon. So this week, a very famous journal here in Brazil has published this news that says that a nearly extinct Amazonian food will be served to authorities at COP30. This very kind and delicious tuber comes to be the aria, which is a very small tuber, actually, Calathea aluia, which is being classified as a superfood because it holds all the essential amino acids. Very few plant species hold all the essential amino acids, and this is one of them. It is highly tolerant to dry environments, and it's being proposed as an alternative to manioc because it's adapted to climatic change environments. So what is happening now in the Amazon is that the climatic events of increased temperature is in the dries of the rivers, it's heating the soil, and the manioc cannot hold it. So many manioc plantations are dying, and this is causing a high problem, a big problem with food security, because 80% of the food in the Amazon is based on manioc. So REI is being proposed as a alternative way of securing food and nutrition to local populations. It comes to be that the aria is an indigenous plant. It has been managed, domesticated by indigenous people since, not domesticated, since 9,500 before present, but use it since 9,500 before present. This picture on the left side is the phytolith that Jennifer Watling has identified in the Teotonio archaeological site. It's also a very non-bioindicator for Amazonian dark earth. So many Amazonian dark earth places, specifically in the southwestern Amazon, has huge amount of aria plants growing naturally without being planted. It's a good plant for being planted in the gardens, but it also grows alone in the forests or in Amazonian dark earth patches. And it's been used for centuries for making beer, for making flour, bread, and other ways of consumption in the Amazon. So this name of almost extinct came to my mind as an issue of vegetable blindness, um, which is the way that we've been calling the unconsciousness of non-indigenous people about a huge useful biodiversity in the Amazon, and it has to do with the process of colonization that has not just made those plants invisible, but also reinforced and commodified some indigenous plants that were important for colonization, as the manioc was, because manioc flour was one of the main motors, one of the main fuels for colonization in the Amazon. And at the same time, as you put effort, as you invest in the commodification of some plants, other plants are being invalidated, forgotten, and also put it as barbarian foods. So the aria and other plants that I'm going to show shortly, they have been classified as a non-civilized food during colonial period, and probably this is why they have been almost extinct. Uh, Even though they are extremely present in some archaeological sites, as this site that Humberto Lombardo has used to propose maize monoculture. It has also phytoliths and pollen of aria, and has also phytoliths and pollen of many other edible plants that are being visibilized by us scientists as well, because we don't know how those plants are being consumed, or because we want to see monoculture, because we want to see progress. These are some other examples of these forgotten plants or invisibilized plants. I'm going to talk about one more of them, to connect to the isolated indigenous people that Francoise has mentioned in the beginning, which is the batata maira, Casimirella rupestris, which has been named as the giant from the forest by Gilton Mendes, an anthropologist working in the Amazon that has rediscovered this plant in his research. In the left side, you have Daniel Rimerimã. Daniel is the only contacted indigenous person from Rimerimã group. They have been decided to be isolated in the 80s of last century, and Daniel has decided to remain. And so he's the only person of this group that we have contact, and he's a living library about tubers and potatoes of the forest. And in this picture, he's collecting a Maira potato nearby his garden in the Purus River. It has been firstly described by Richard Spruce when he was traveling to the upper Rio Negro basin as another plant species, and it has changed the identification, the scientific name. It was a Nicosinacea, and now it's another scientific name is the Casimirella rupestre. And it has been, after Spruce's description, almost forgotten again. And the botanic collection, the economic botany collection of the Kew Gardens has a specimens that was collected by Richard Spruce. Has a collection of flower of this species, and but not much information about it. So this plant has been completely erased from dishes and from the foodways of traditional people, but as far once Gilton started to reading Richard Spruce's collection and papers, we started to ask people, indigenous people, if they remind about this giant from the forest. And when you do ask, when you show pictures, when you say about, because this tuber can reach 200 kilos when it's in the forest. So it's an outstanding plant, which people do remind. So what we had is that many indigenous groups started to say, "Oh yes, I remember. My mom used to." I have, I think, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna rush a bit. Yes, my mom, my grandmother used to eat it, and I do remember of it. So we started to look for it. We have described the starch grains of it, and we have been searching for it in archaeological records. Um, and one of the main, the Mayra potato is one of the main ingredients of the buried breads, which are those kinds of indigenous breads that is found buried in the ground in what we call buried bakeries. This is a name given by Daniel Canguçu, the partner of the National Indigenous Foundation. And it's a kind of bread that is found in gardens and in forests and in orchards by by people nowadays. Some of them describe that they eat those breads and they are still edible, but non-group nowadays recall making those kinds of breads yet. We have been analyzing and compiling data of those breads for some years now. We have records of more than 50 breads in museum, particular collections, and in indigenous village, because people, when they found those breads, they keep it. We have been dating these breads, and I can talk more about the dates after if somebody wants. But some breads are dated from pre-colonial period, so we know that at least since 1000 AD, those kinds of foods are being produced. And we have been identifying a lot of plant remains inside those bread matrix. I just brought some of the starch grains that we have identified. Circulated in red, we have Mayra potato, but we also have maize, manioc, pepper, sweet potato, palms, and probably we have a lot of chewed things, because a very common technique for fermentation in the Amazon is that you chew the plant and you split it and you add the amylase enzyme for starting the fermentation process. Well, one of those bakeries, and then I'm going to start finishing my presentation, I swear. One of those bakeries, it has been identified in the Katawishi land. Today, it's a place that is in the border of the Katawishi land. Katawishi it's an indigenous group of Tupi speaking, of Tupi language, sorry, and they have been described by several researchers in the Amazon. I'm just bringing one of the main historical documents that we have about of these people, a drawing made by Speaks and Martius in the 19th century. But nowadays they are an isolated people, probably due to colonization pressure in these lands. They have decided to become isolated. They were lastly saw in the 1950 decade, and there is in the border of their land a huge bakery, a place full of indigenous breads buried in the soil that we are starting to work on and that we have planned to dig in the next year. So I just wanted to actually finishing by bringing this citation of Marchand, which I think it's really elusive, is really elucidative actually, of how famine has become a colonization strategy, and how this is what, for me, is what explains the first graphic you saw by Humpers and collaborators about extinction and rediscovery of biodiversity. He said, it's in Spanish, I'm going to translate as I can. So he said that diseases and dyings between these feligreses, which is a way that he calls the indigenous people, have been followed by demoralization that has distracted the ability to continuing remembering of the earth, about the earth and about the land. With interrupted reminders, hungry has sprout. Those who could walk has abandoned their gardens and walked by the forest, eating fruits, roots, and other foods that their gardens and other foods that they could find occasionally. So he's describing how the colonization impact in this area. This is a picture, oops, sorry. This is a picture of attraction post in the Cunhahan, this area of Purus River, where they show a way that the FUNAI, this former indigenous foundation, has decided to attract indigenous people, to start colonizing, not colonizing, they said that they were civilizing them. So this is a picture that shows to me a bit what all this colonization and neo-colonization process has impacted in terms of biodiversity, food security, and access to biodiversity in the Amazon. I think we are still seeing that there is a huge connection between indigenous lands and the preservation of biodiversity, which has been acknowledged by several acknowledged and highlighted now, especially now that we are discussing the effects of climate change in nature and in for human life. And I think this is another phase of colonization that we don't say much about, but is how this colonization is also seen in the biodiversity loss that we were seeing in those plant databases. But I would just like to highlight that some of these plants that are being classified as almost extinct, there are actually plants that resist in indigenous lands. So protecting those lands, it's also a way of protecting biodiversity. This is kind of what I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry about if I went further on time. And then here is my mail in case someone wants to reach me. And I would like to say thank you once more to all of you and for the attention.
Thank you, Francoise, for the invitation, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Before I started my presentation, I brought a bag from the Sierra, from Colombia. I would like you to pass it on and then play with it and see it and see the technique.
The base is done as a circle, and it's the foundation of the earth. And Marian's got to be lamb as well.
Moving the discussion and the conversation towards the more material aspect of plants, and I'm gonna revise a couple of examples, and it's kind of like thought-provoking presentation. So I'm very happy to hear your thoughts on this. And so In terms of like archaeological materials, we all been aware that perishable material, organic materials, especially plant fiber materials, have been in the archaeological record, but they usually tend to be invisible. So the big question is, where are these materials? And we can see through the analysis of fibers, of plant materials, and other artifacts that they are being presented in early humans' occupation around the world. So, and that's part of like related to what Manuel and Laura was talking about, the idea of plants always being related to food production. So I think I'm gonna take you into another corner or another journey when we talk about plants and organic materials. So where these ideas come from, where this idea about basketry has been the earliest or the first tool. So basically, it's an understanding that basketry has always been part of archaeology and anthropological studies, but always been in a secondary position. We know that plant-based technology are being like super important for human development and cultural development, especially for carrying, containing, and connecting people and materials. And I like the idea of basketry and plant-based technology as a way to connect ecological and technological entanglement. But my inspiration comes from this very beautiful essay written by Ursula Le Guin, where she proposed that basket can be very instrumental to challenge the normative structure of how we understand human societies and artifacts. And also, this beautiful compendium of material culture of basketry, where Stephanie Ban and Victoria Mitchell proposed that basketry is not just metaphorically the fabric of society, but literally, and such an important technology for human societies around the world. So this talk is gonna go into 3 different elements. First is proposing what can baskets, string bags, and sling tell us about the ecological intimacy, gender practices, and also botanical heritage. In order to do that, because I'm from an archaeological science background, I will try to pull in different or borrowing from material science and ethnography and plant humanities, how we can answer this question and offer you different perspective and space as well for discussion. And I'm going to rely on previous ethnographic work where it can help us approach this question and maybe trying to find a way to answer if it was the first tool. So in a sort of a definition of how I'm looking baskets, sling, or bags, I'm interpreting this as a container and carrier devices that are containing humans, literally, metaphorically, and they are circulating knowledge, all type of knowledge related to behavior, plants, seasonality, rules, uses, and also aspect of how people integrate the ecological botanical heritage in the way how they live and they produce material culture. So I'm recentering basket and plant-based craft as a critical form of both material and culture. Material culture is such a common we use in anthropology and archaeology, but literally basket are really beautiful cues to disentangle and understand the material aspect of it and also the culture that is carried around it. Also, it's a way to explore a human-plant relationship beyond food and beyond the concept of domestication that you already discussed previously. Investigate the gender dimension and the relation to ecological knowledge, but beyond the binary or the dichotomy of female and male, and also contributes to material engagement and indigenous ontologies and or animals. And also part of like this talk is trying to shift the theoretical perspective and use basketry and fiber making as a profound way to think about the embodiment and the cognitive process in the practice of human environment, and not necessarily, but also physical, climate, and geographic element of environment, but also from this psychological perspective of affordances that environment is everything that is surrounding us. And also the relation that has containers and basket in extending the boundaries of our bodies, and the concept of phenomenology about how we relate to artifacts and how artifacts relate to us. And I'm also inspired in material engagement theory, in quite recent works in plant humanities, and the concept of meta-tool that I'm gonna revise at the end of this talk. I think I'm gonna put my laptop here because it's more practical. And then also part of this proposal is try to highlight the plant people place relationship as not as foundational and cultural, ecological, and political importance, including the relation nature of plants and the role they have for ethnobotany and ethnoecology, to understand ecosystem not simply as resources to be managed, but also to endure cultural and ecological landscape. And through this presentation as well, offering a framework to interpret how fibre, basket, and any other plant artifacts can embody evidence of indigenous agency and plant people in entanglement. And finally, even though I've been trying to avoid the gender aspect of it, it's kind of crucial to understand and how gender emerged in the analysis of baskets, string bags, and sling. So I'm going to look through a cross-cultural approach and try to weave aspects of plants into the context of colonial sources. So there are two important elements in this presentation. First, most of the images you will see through this presentation belongs to museum collections from the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology here based in Cambridge, and also some representation of ethnographic photography, which I've been trying to avoid, but for the purpose of this talk, I will use it. I will briefly go through examples in basketry in Yecuana society and Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia and Papua New Guinea, to actually reflect a little bit of the uses and symbolism of these plants into artifacts. And in a very well-humoured terms, interrogate the animacy and language that plants and materials have in their own. And when plants were objects are in current communication with us. And I don't know if you know the book Breaking Sweetgrass. We recently had a discussion in our department about this book, which I highly recommend. It's a very beautiful book. So the first example I'm gonna start off, and closer to what we had listened today, it's in the Amazon, in the Yecuana society groups that, as we saw today in the north part of South America, this is a very, like, the area where people have been lived, built structure, and have been managing the land, has been developed different strategy of subsistence, and obviously they have been producing artifacts, many of them. Among them, this famous and beautiful plated basketry. And there is a beautiful work by David Gus that was suggested by Manuel to me a few months ago, but I revised it, and I was realizing all these relationships that exist between the production of these plate open baskets and aspect of the social structure of this society. Overall, there is a long list of potent plants that has been used for the production of this basketry, but most of them are for different part of the basket. Basket have different names, as you can see in this different terminology, as we can see in that column. And also we can see that the material as well is quite diverse. But most of the majority of this basketry has been relied in a monocot that grows in the Amazon, where people are using the leaf for the production of this basketry. We come back again to the topic of plants, and the topic of plants in post-colonial frame, and also the use of plant resources that escape a little bit from ideas of domestication and also ideas about plants for food. So if we look at some examples that we have found in the museum here, we can see that it's a very aesthetic type of basketry. There is a connection with the weaving and so on, and that's something that also David Gus proposes in his works of ethnography. And it has a function of complex system of knowledge, carrying social, cosmological, and obviously historical meaning. But there is an element that goes beyond the aesthetic, and it makes a blend elements of form, texture, color, and even smell. So the selection of plants, the production of plants, the aesthetic of the basketry are coming all together, and are not independent from each other in the same way that it's not independent from who is using the basket, who is making the basket, and when the basket has the material for the basket has been collected. So we know that this basket as well were used for certain different production. So they were using as a sieve for the production of cassava and maniocs, and plant that we were mentioned earlier on. So also has this functional element in society associated to food production, and actually the mixing two elements, two forms of plants coming together. Also, other forms of basketry in the Yacuana societies, the waha, which are painted and decorated type of basketry that are produced by men and are associated to ritual marriage, where there is a kind of like process of producing and weaving a basket in the early stages of marriage into a more complex and painted basket once a certain period of time happens. So basketry as well are signal certain elements about marriage, social relationship, and obviously in this case, maybe gender task in the Yacuana communities. And also, there are all these myths about the spirits in the Amazon, in the forests, and how these spirits are related to the plant that's been used for collecting and making this basket. And there is an element of ancestry, but also an element that it has certain consents. So it's the consent of being in the forest, collecting the plants for the weaving process, and also how there are certain rituals to handle these materials. That is, are not simply chain operatoire, how people were producing or are producing basketry in a simple way. Each stage actually has to kind of like purity process. So the organization of that state, the process has an explanation based on this kind of myth. So basket making, it has both, and probably many other elements beyond technical and spiritual process, blending the material craft, but also cosmological order. And so to conclude and to kind of like wrap up that part of this part of the example in the presentation, obviously there is a materiality of the basket. It's not just simply raw material woven into a form. It has elements of avoidance and life-threatening and elements of purity, and as David Gus say, is a distinction between a form and content that comes to dominate so much how we approach ways to see basketry and to understand the production of certain materials. And what I think what is kind of beautiful as well, and coming back about the concept of containing a container as well, if we look at a picture and the cover of the book as well, and this idea that's been proposed several times about like the roof as an inverted basketry or basket as well, and the idea of containing. So materials being built and materials that are containing society, metaphorically and literally. Then we can also revise, and also from materials from the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology here, a basket from Tierra del Fuego. So we know that the last tip of the continent where indigenous communities were living for a long time until the 18th and 19th century genocide in what is today Chile and Patagonia and Argentina, Patagonia, or that part of like Tierra del Fuego. There's this different type of basketry. So we are not the open plated basket. We have a more coiled, closed, individual sort of basketry. Also from the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, as for a long time has been interpreted that the production of basketry was a female activity, and has been kind of like debate about the production of basketry, the reason, the function that it has, this type of basketry, and also the technique, which is very related to the type of plant people were using for this. Sorry. So what we have, if we compare to the opened Decona basketry that are made from leaf, we're looking at rather different type of basket that are made of stems, and it has a different technology. It has a different pattern of weaving, and this pattern of weaving, it has a terminology as well in Selknam and Yagant communities in this part of the world. So we know that the baskets are not made of palm or this kind of palm-like materials. They are made of rushes, plants that grows around wetlands or like more humid spaces. They are collected in small bundles. They are put in the fire to be processed to enhance their flexibility. Then they are dry. So the description of the process of basketry production in this area, in Tierra del Fuego, it seems to have a more technical and more like functional interpretation. And also the weaving technique, it requires a different type of tools, requires that people really use a different other artifacts in their production, and especially has a very important process of fresh grass production to keep this like three-dimensional shape. So there is an understanding and an ecological knowledge of the stems of the plant, how to produce, how to weave the basket, and how to make it in such a way that when it's dry, it still keeps shape. And in terms of social aspect, where women and girls who were responsible for the production of vase making, and here we have a picture as well from the photographic collection from the museum, where we can see men with a fur and also carrying a basket, sort of basket bag in his hand. So as I was saying, the collection of the plants has to be when the plant is tender and is green, and it has to be woven in such a way that it kept the shape in the future when it gets dry, sorry. And it has this very particular technique that has been defined in terminology of the Selknam and Yagant people. One of the big questions about all these ethnographic noted about the basketry, it is like this terminology really define technique, or define technique and plant, or define technique, plant, or place, where the plant is coming, what kind of technique you're applying, what kind of plant people are using. And that's still something that hasn't been part of like the research or publication, and it still has a kind of like mixed. We'll still need to look at this and really understanding the terminology, or not even the terminology, the way how people refer to this. Actually, it's just a technological, is ecological, or it's social. And unfortunately, this is not the best picture, but as well, like in Tierra del Fuego communities, we're using a very long list of plants. Most of them, again, are not being domesticated, so we can define it as a wild plants. But it's here we have rushes that has been used, or they are used for the production of basketry. So Are we, again, seeing aspect of affordances of the plants? Are the plants that actually are very useful for the production basket? Or there is a kind of ecological and social decision of using certain species and not others? And then the last example, which is my favorite one, is billions in Papua New Guinea. And so we're moving to a different part of the world. We are not in the Americas anymore. And in this, inspired by this very beautiful work, the idea of string bags with a different technical structure. We are not just, we're still talking about three-dimensional objects. And that's why I have the bag and I was circulating. It's not this type of bag, but it has kind of the same structure and the same idea. Were quite important in terms of like the production, not only because it were important for carrying artifacts or for keeping people, enable people to move things or circulate elements, but also because bilum means womb, and bilums were being used for carry babies.
Yeah.
That completely changed the use of, it's not changed, but completely put us in a situation where we are thinking about all these containers and all these bags in other examples, and really opens up, at least to me, the big question about how we are interpreting material. So the patterns of the bilums are intergenerational. So they are kind of pattern that's been coming from your family, but also it's been very, their innovation in the patterns. As you can see, most of the patterns are made with the combination of plants and pigment that are made of plants. So there is another layer of plant uses in the production of bilum. And these are from another monocots, another plant that's probably has been managed in certain way, and a palm-like that grows, and people use leaves for and produce and process the leaf of this plant for producing this looping bag in this society. So coming back to the general topic of this research network and thinking about plant and decolonization, in some ways or another, the form or the shape of a basketry and a looping bag is extending the cycle of the plants. Plants is being collected and processed and put into a new form, giving a new shape, a new life, and a new function. And also, as we were looking very quickly in terms of like the type of plants that people were using, either basketry or not, there is a valuable ethnotaxonomy and information of how people were naming techniques, naming plants for the purposes of basketry and sling and looping bag. And obviously, in order to understand the plants, there has to be a body engagement and the senses. And coming back to the idea of engagement theory, there is an element of thinking in action, something that also Ingold has been discussed in his work, in the way how we are making and thinking, and we are making as we do, as we construct and build. But this making is also giving information for us, or sorry, is the making as well is the one that is placing plants in a different scenario that are not just purely for food production. And also, I think it's important to think about botanical vocabularies. I'm gonna keep using the native, I'm gonna keep using the English version or the Latin version, or I'm gonna incorporate local terminology and how people are classifying plants. The classification of plants and taxonomy are valid? How those language encodes ecological perception. So people are collecting a plant that's gonna help, it's gonna make a basket. We need to kind of like dissolve this kind of category, and how basketry as a plant object can give us an opportunity to think about ecological perception. And really, it is important bridging the scientific and the indigenous taxonomy, which for me, it's an open question. Do we need to make a space to the scientific taxonomy, or can we both be combined, or we can make a decision and just keep one, like the indigenous taxonomy? So I think in order to do that, we have to learn to speak different languages. And I think the making is a way to communicate with the plant, with an artifacts, and maybe we have to reframe categories. And also thinking about the ecological and the environment as a gender dimension as well. So that reflects, ecological intimacy, and there is an interdependence, and something we saw in the first two presentations where plant, people, and places are interconnected to each other. Also, there's been a kind of like revival of thinking about women's labor in the past as being invisible, especially in archaeology, and how we can readdress that kind of emptiness or invisible sort of materials and also technology. And reframing basketry as core technology make us understand the botanical heritage and craft ecology, maybe, and also trying to integrate this in archaeological science and foster a dialogue in the indigenous knowledge system and maybe collection-based research. But we know, coming back to the beginning of my presentation about the perishable technology and invisible technology, the question is, where are these earliest evidence of fibre? So we know that overall, there are evidence of early uses of plants in prehistory. Either they are indirect or they are evidence, very small, very humble, but they are there. They are somewhere, as they are in the Americas as well, early on. So we know that it's just the invisible, is like we are trying to understand a long-standing of production of fiber artifacts, which in this case are basketry and sling and look back. But why I'm so obsessed with basketry and bags, I'm coming back again to quite recently a recent work on human evolution and evolutionary perspective of the importance that mobile container has in the evolution of cognitive in humans. Container as early tool actually were used to move things, to carry resources, tools, and we come back again to the idea of moving babies. Also enable us to accumulate and carry artifacts, and also foresight, planning, and technological innovation free our hands in some ways or another. Basketry as well as a way of as a form and material culture as well, embody techniques, and also it's a way to a creative problem solving. And as a cultural fabric, as I presented in my second slide, basketry is both practical and symbolic that carry memory, meaning, and care. And coming back to the idea of women and the botanic world. So we know, and recently coming back to the human cognition and perception, that this intertwined transformation of plants into containers or bags to, again, carry babies or carry artifacts has been part of what people are thinking. So even in child development, the importance of carrying stuff, like the importance of bag and mobile container, it has a quite fundamental way to understand how we perceive the world, how we move in the world. And quite recently, which I think that's a very thought-provoking book, and I don't know how I feel about it, it's the recent publication about the Botanic Age, where this is kind of like a beautiful metaphor of the embodiment of the rhythm. So the moment that we became bipedal, our babies we couldn't carry our babies in a way that we did when we weren't bipedal. So we needed a sort of element, material culture, that helped us to keep the baby close And that's why the baby sling probably has been the earliest, one of the earliest artifacts that are related to care, rhythm, and mobility. And as a future direction, and coming back to Ursula Le Guin, I think there is a way to use a way to look at containers and basketry to maybe rewrite the narrative of who we are, material culture, and human society. And thank you very much.
Thank you.